talked about resiliency and focused on stormwater capture, but also the bigger picture of how we can begin to think of one water. And this panel is part one of a two-part group of water experts, and we're going to talk about innovation, implementation, and financing of water infrastructure. And this panel is going to focus more on the innovation, and then we'll take a quick break, switch the panel out, and bring up the finance team, and we'll talk about financing some of these great ideas. I'm very happy to introduce Adam Krantz. Adam is the CEO of the National Association of Water Agencies. He is in an agency where he advocates on behalf of our nation's public clean water agencies on an array of regulatory, legislative, legal, and communication initiatives geared toward the ensuring of a sustainable, clean water around our country. And I think what's really interesting, and I want to hear from him about, is the water utility of the future. Adel Hagat-Kahil is well known to the Verde Exchange participants. He's the Assistant Director of the Los Angeles City's Bureau of Sanitation. He's a registered civil engineer and is a leader in the One Water integrated holistic water movement. We're happy to have Adele here. And from Northern California, Harlan Kelly is the general manager of the San Francisco PUC. And unlike LA, it's a city and a county together, and he has responsibility as the general manager of the SFPUC for retail drinking water and wastewater services to San Francisco, as well as wholesale water to 3 Bay Area counties, green hydroelectric and solar power to San Francisco's municipal departments and residents. And when you hear about the Hetch Hetchy Dam, you can talk to Harlan. He'll tell us all about that. And finally on this panel, we have Dr. Kelly Sanders. Dr. Sanders is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and she is an engineer, and she's in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and her research aims to ease the tensions between human and natural systems through technical, regulatory, and market intervention, with a particular emphasis on reducing the environmental impacts of providing energy and water services. So that will provide a great intellectual and policy framework for our discussion. I thought to set the table in this panel, it would be great to have a national perspective, and particularly the kinds of things that we're seeing across the country as we deal with water as a national issue. So I've asked Adam to start, and why doesn't everybody just stay at their seats, and we'll let Adam lead off.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Kathleen, I appreciate it. So my organization is called the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, NACWA. We're a not-for-profit organization focused on advocacy in DC on clean water issues. We represent about 1,100 or so publicly owned treatment works and stormwater utilities across the country. And one of the things that I wanted to say when we talk about innovation in the water sector, that's a big concept, and it's a big concept not just because what does it mean to be innovative, but it's a big concept to say what is our water sector. And we've heard a lot about this on the first panel. We've also heard in the opening session what I thought was a very interesting discussion on the complex and oftentimes uncomfortable relationship sometimes between the local communities, state communities, and federal government. Obviously all those should be building off of a strong partnership. We forget sometimes, as a very basic matter, that a lot of the local utilities, state regulators, et cetera, have jobs because there were these things called the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act and environmental statutes that came down from the federal government that create a regulatory structure and a legislative structure to do the work, the great work that you all do, folks like Harlan and Adele do every day. And obviously, as such, we should be working together in partnership to solve these issues and become more innovative. But let me talk a little bit about this concept of what is the water sector. And I think when we talk about innovation, we need to understand exactly what it is we're talking about here. And that was talked about a little bit on the panel previously under the terminology of governance. And I think that's a very good term for it. Across this country of ours, we have well over 55,000 drinking water utilities of all sizes, rural, urban, east, west, large, medium, small, you name it. We have over about 17,000 publicly owned treatment works doing wastewater work, and now we have stormwater utilities being created regularly or sometimes falling under those same wastewater treatment plants. So growing numbers of utilities there, let alone irrigation districts and a whole number of other types of agencies at the local level. Some of these are privately owned. Some of these, most of them in our world, are publicly owned. About 88% of the population is served by public drinking water facilities, about 12%, 10% maybe by private. On the wastewater side, similarly, even the numbers are higher, probably about 95, 96% of the public served by public wastewater treatment agencies, about 3-4% by private sector utilities in that sphere. And what we have, though, is a system where a lot of the highly resourced utilities are obviously in the large urban areas, right? And there is where we're seeing sort of the incubation of innovation, right? The incubation centers. We're seeing technology hubs being developed. I think there are some folks outside displaying the work that they're doing in terms of innovative sort of technology hubs here in LA. We see it in Chicago, in Milwaukee, in DC, in San Francisco, in a lot of key areas. But that is not the general rule, right? And when you take away sort of the largest of our utilities, let's say the 100 largest utilities, you're still left with 50,000 plus small drinking water utilities and 16,000 plus small wastewater treatment facilities. So how is that innovation going to be transferred to raise up the sector as a whole, if you will? And I think that is the area we need to focus on now as a sector. I know that folks here are talking about the LA region specifically. It's a unique region. It's a leader on innovation, but how do we transport and transform the whole sector, transport the information that you all are developing here, and transform the water sector as a whole across California, across the region, and then ultimately the entire nation? That, I think, is the most critical question that we have in front of us from a national perspective. NACWA is working on this from both a lobbying perspective with the federal government. EPA is very interested in this concept of peer-to-peer sharing, trying to put some funding into it to make sure that we can raise up the sector. And in the wake of things like Flint, the Toledo water shutdown internationally, we heard just before in the last panel what's going on in Cape Town. We want to make sure we're able to have uninterrupted service for the growing population and growing industrial base of our country. So the stakes are huge in terms of getting this governance issue right. And I would argue that to my left, and I'm not going to take a whole lot more time here, are two utilities of the future leaders, both for the city of LA and San Francisco PUC, and Harlan and Adele. Listen to them a lot more than from me at the national level. They're doing it on the ground. They're doing the actual work of what it means to become a utility of the future. The utility of the future is being spawned, in my view, because of growing affordability concerns, in part at the local level, even our urban centers, where we have a disparity of wealth between the poor and the rich. How do you evenly distribute rates in order for all to pay for it? It's creating a pressure on the utility to do more with less, to stretch every ratepayer dollar, but also to start thinking about themselves as resource recovery agencies where the waste stream that they have is not actually waste anymore. It is actually a resource. So whether that means phosphorus, whether it means energy, whether it means the water itself in terms of water reuse. The concept of calling something wastewater in California or anywhere in the world is insane when you think about it. There's no such thing as wastewater. So how can the utilities basically start to think of themselves more entrepreneurially, if you will, in terms of what they're sitting on by way of being able to bring in some additional revenue and stretch that ratepayer dollar even further. So I think what you're going to hear from Adele and from Harlan is this sort of one water approach. There is and should be no differentiation from NACWA's perspective between drinking water, wastewater, storm water. It is all one water, and we need to figure out how to make the most use of that resource for the sole purpose, really, out of necessity, but also out of deference and benefit to the ratepayer, who right now, frankly, is struggling. And if you think about those struggles where you have a growing urban center, many of our urban centers are not growing. LA is unique. And I always come here and I'm always amazed to hear, 1 out of every 15 Americans lives in this region alone. It is a staggering number. You hear a very different discussion if you go to one of these types of meetings in a Detroit, right, or in a Cleveland. This is a unique discussion. And the issues that you all are dealing with here need to be transported out to the broader community and the broader country. Issues, for example, the digital utility of the future, how we're going to be able to become a utility that gathers our information in a way that is reliable and sustainable to let us make the best choices in terms of regulatory priorities, right? If we need to address X first, let us address X first because we're going to get the biggest bang for the environmental buck. We need to be moving toward adaptive management approaches. We need to be moving toward digital and technology-based approaches. And then we also need to start to trust the utility, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, start trusting the utility as a co-equal with the state and the federal governments, in the sense that 50 years now, in the wake of the passage of the Clean Water Act, folks, in my view, like Harlan, like Adele, they are the ones who know best what their ratepayers need, what their community needs. There needs to be a certain amount of deference to that in terms of how we're structured from a regulatory standpoint. And the goal ultimately, when you take the pressure being created by all of these different concepts and thoughts and challenges, needs to be a true local, state, federal partnership so that we're all working together toward shared goals and shared values. With that, I'll stop there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Harlan, why don't we just go down the line? He's got a mic.
So I'm from San Francisco, and it's really interesting the opportunities we have in San Francisco. Again, I'm the general manager of the Public Utilities Commission, and I'm so fortunate because I have, I'm embracing One Water, and I'm in charge of all of the water in San Francisco. And in fact, we had this big argument with Rec and Park because they were using groundwater, and I had to tell them, that's my water, and you got to pay for it. And actually, that was a lively discussion. But the opportunity that exists when you can break the silos, and I can't blame any other agency except myself. And so, but within San Francisco and within the PUC, it's been really challenging because, we have one of the greatest water supply, I believe, in the world, which is our Hetch Hetchy water supply, which is snow comes from the Sierra Mountains. It's in our reservoir, and it's brought down 167 miles via gravity, 3,000 feet above us. It produces hydropower, and from that water, we not only provide water to San Franciscans, but we have wholesale customers that we sell it to as well, about 2.6 million users. And so it's just really a great system, and everyone recognizes that. We've done a very good job of telling everyone that this is a great system, and it crossed 3 seismic faults. So the voters jumped at a chance to have a revenue bond, to have us invest $4.6 billion to make sure that this pristine water supply will get to them. So we did a great job. But then we said, well, we got to diversify our water supply. You just can't rely on one source. So we started talking about we're going to use groundwater, and we got to make sure the groundwater wells are working, and so we interject a little groundwater. And do you think everyone was outraged? What? You contaminated our Hetchy supply. So we had to educate them that 2 supplies is better than 1. So we're trying to get over that hurdle. And now we're talking about this whole One Water. We're talking about, stormwater and just sanitary water going to our treatment plant. We treat about 70 million gallons a day, and we just dump it into the bay and the ocean. And so we're looking at ways that we can recover that. So with the One Water SF is to use the best source for, for the best application. And so we're looking at irrigation, because we're using Hetchy water and groundwater for irrigation. So we broke ground on this West Side recycle plant. And so our folks are really excited about this whole concept. And so they're, believe it or not, although San Francisco is 7 square miles, there's a lot of development happening in San Francisco. One of the big ones was the Warrior Stadium. And our people were so excited, especially the wastewater folks. They say, hey, the most challenging time that we're dealing with the stadium. And I said, what? They said halftime, because that's when everybody flushes their toilet. And I was like, wow. And they said, yeah, when Curry is shooting those threes, we're taking care of everybody ones and twos. And so they were just so excited about this. And so it's just the excitement that we have. We try to raise up all the resources that we have and look for the best use for those supplies. And so one of the things that we are doing is looking at eco-districts, because there's opportunity where you can have a development recycle water within that campus. Because right now, the way that we're thinking about it is having a treatment plant that's centralized and then distributed, which means that you got to rip up every street to get that source there. Within the eco district, you can actually have that. And so we've been working with Hunters Point Shipyard. The Giants have a little area that they're building housing on. So we're looking at opportunities for this One Water. And also One Water includes power as well, because we generate power from our water system. Like I said, we generate hydropower. So we bring that back down. And then with our treatment plant, we're investing $2 billion. We're looking at how we can utilize that energy that we create. And so we're looking at a resource center versus a treatment plant. And so there are some great opportunities that we have when we focus on all the water supplies and how you can best use them. But I think the biggest challenge is getting folks used to the concept is going to be the biggest challenge. And I think for us, the biggest challenge, as I mentioned earlier today, is our Hetch Hetchy water supply. Everyone do not even want you to even think about putting something else in that water supply, and it becomes with that education. And given that it may not be there for a long term. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing.
Great. Adele.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone. I want to tell you for LA Sanitation, your number 2 is my number 1, so okay. Yeah, it's great to be here with the great leaders, from our associations, Sister Utility, and the academic community. I think it's, I always talk about the 3 things that we need to use to address our challenges in the future. I call them the 3 I's: the integration, innovation, and inclusion. That's really what we're talking about. I mean, it's all about what we're doing. Adam talked about how utilities, and I was proud to be a president of NACWA for a year, a couple of years ago. And we discussed how we are transforming our utilities to become better, to serve the industry better, to think differently, to bring innovation into our industry, and we're doing that. I'm proud that we're doing that. And that's by us working together. And I know one of the things that we need to continue working on is how we can now mentor others, how we can work in the region to help the smaller utilities be part of this whole solution. In LA, we're doing the same thing. We're innovating, we're integrating, we're including. And I want to acknowledge our partners, Water and Power. I mean, they're here with us. I'm on the panel here, but it's all a partnership. We have broken the silos. We're working together. It doesn't matter what kind of water. We're all doing it together. Under the leadership of Mayor Garcetti and the City Council, we are transforming our relationship with water. It has to be different. We realize that, and that commitment at the highest level has been that we need to do something different to become resilient and sustainable in Los Angeles. We have very aggressive goals in the mayor's office that's measured. It's in the performance reviews of each general manager. We meet monthly as part of Water Cabinet to address these issues and these challenges and look for how we can work together to continue developing and addressing these issues. We all have the same challenges. Doesn't matter. Either have too much water, too little water. We have water pollution issues. We have limited funding. We have climate change, sea level rise. All these things are hitting us from different directions. And the way we need to address it is we need to be smart how we innovate and how we meet these things. And the first thing I would say is we need to start thinking about how we leverage resources. We can't be one solution, one project and one solution. We need to think about how we can leverage and build on these projects to provide more than one benefit. Because if we do it right, we are really helping our community at the end, who at the end are paying for what we're trying to do. So if we build a project that's addressing flooding, at the same time capturing stormwater and putting it in the ground to recharge the water supply, if we're capturing it to address water quality that's going to the LA River to help us comply with our stormwater permit, if we're doing it to provide the community a green space for the community to enjoy, providing a habitat, providing something back to the community in a lot of communities that suffered for many years from the impact of lack of investment in infrastructure. We need to do that, and that's how we do it, by bringing together and finding solutions. In LA, we're doing it. We are doing it. We need to do more. We're building projects in collaboration with Water and Power in green streets. We're building streets in the city not only to green the streets, but also to capture stormwater, put it in the ground for the groundwater recharge, and to address water quality. In South LA, we build green alleys, partner with the community to bring, and with the water district, WRD was a partner, the state was a partner. I know Felicia is here somewhere. And we work together on building projects to not only enhance the quality of life in the communities, but also capture stormwater, addressing it, filter it, put it in the ground, and provide something to the community. The example I heard from the community in South LA when we opened the Avalon Green Alley, I know Wing was involved heavily in that effort. The community used to turn their back at that alley. That alley was an eyesore. The kids could not walk in that alley. The community were partners, and now we transferred this alley now to a place that the community now is turning their face, having their barbecues in their backyards to that alley. The kids are playing in the alley, walking through it, while doing water job, capturing stormwater, putting it in the ground, and also cleaning it up. These are things that are being replicated across the city. If you look at Machado Lake, we just invested a lot of money in Machado Lake to clean Machado Lake and provide something back to the community. We partnered with our recreational park departments to provide a great project. But that lake is dependent on replenishing the water. We need to bring more water in, and we use potable water. What did we come up with as part of the One Water solution is to upgrade our treatment plant in the harbor area to advanced water purification, and now we're building with Water and Power a pipeline going to the industries in the area and supplying water to that lake to make sure the lake is healthy and continues to survive. That's partnership. LAX is doing a huge project right now in upgrading the airport, and we are now working with Water and Power and us to build an advanced water purification facility at Hyperion to bring water to LAX as part of their upgrades. That's the partnership we're talking about. That's breaking the silos at every level and thinking outside the box. The One Water LA plan is a great example of bringing the community, bringing the stakeholders, and thinking outside the box. We've done a great job in water conservation, and I know Water and Power is very proud of what they're doing and what they've done, and we all have to be. The mayor is very proud of the amount of reduction. We've done 20% reduction most recently over the last couple of years. But what we're seeing is the wastewater flow that supplies recycled water is less. So our wastewater flows are low, so that means recycled water cannot be generated. So the wastewater treatment plants and water reclamation plants that are closer to the demand, where groundwater recharge is best in the San Fernando Valley and the city, we're seeing less flow. So for us to really maximize the recycling and get it closer to what I call connecting the dots and drops, getting it closer to the demand, close to supply, closer to the demand, we actually rethought our planning effort. I know Ali and Lenice are here from the team. We actually thought about building our sewer system differently. We had sewers in part of the city that used to go down to the ocean to Hyperion. we thought maybe what we need to do as part of this One Water LA plan that's just completed is we need to reverse the flow in some parts of the city to bring the flow back to our water reclamation plant in the San Fernando Valley. That's where it's ideal for us to maximize recycled water and put it back in the ground where it's most beneficial. That's rethinking our efforts. We talked about we're building a sewer to address the capacity of the sewer system closer to the LA River in Atwater Village, in that area around Lake Glendale. And what we decided that basically it's better than building the sewer and taking the flow all the way to Hyperion. We actually stopped the project and now are building a larger expansion of LA Glendale with storage to maximize recycled water at that location. To me, it's all about connecting these dots, drops, and it takes leadership, takes partnership, and takes people like you and us working together to help us move the ball forward.
Great. Adele, thank you. Kelly?
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Can everyone hear me? My name is Kelly Sanders, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And what I'm looking at USC with my research group is really this relationship between energy and water. Before I moved to California, I was in Austin, Texas, doing my dissertation. And Texas is a huge energy producing state. So we were really looking at how we might use non-traditional sources of water to placate some of the energy issues that Texas faces and water issues that Texas faces. But I was always kind of looking down the 10, way down the 10, to Southern California, because I thought it was fascinating that you have the second largest city in the United States that's pretty dependent on imports. So the majority of the water that's coming into the city is imported. Most of our water resources are in the northern part of the state, and most of the people are in the southern part of the state. So from an energy perspective, that was quite fascinating to me and something that I wanted to be a part of. Climate change is obviously exacerbating that system. We have a lot less snowpack. So that system that we built is going to be challenged in the future. And at the same time, the state is incredibly progressive in terms of its environmental priorities. So things like energy efficiency and renewable energy integration are very huge priorities of the state. And those too also have challenges. So as you move in the energy sector from large dispatchable resources that are easy to control to resources like solar PV and wind, which are more intermittent, you kind of have to move your system in a way that's more demand side oriented. So the past energy system looked like dispatching power plants to meet our demands, and we could kind of do whatever we wanted to. In the future, we're going to be more a part of this solution. You know, we're going to have to think about our energy consuming behavior to think about how we might be integrating some of these renewable resources. And so where I'm going with this is that the water sector in California is incredibly energy intensive. So there's huge opportunities in terms of the energy sector becoming offering energy solutions in that space. You think about the fact that the State Water Project, for example, is the #1 energy consumer in the state. A statistic that you hear a lot is that 19% of our electricity is for the water sector. The majority of that is actually for water heating. A lot of that is for water pumping, but the majority is actually for water heating. So sometimes that's a detail that goes missed. So bringing it back to my research group, I'm really looking at how you might solve problems in the energy space or the water space, but also create opportunities in the opposite space. So some of the things that we're doing is looking at energy efficiency opportunities, obviously. How can you reduce the energy intensities of water services? And as we move to less imports, there's huge opportunities in terms of increasing local water resources, but we still have to be cognizant of the energy demands of those new resources. For example, a lot of people see desalination as kind of the silver bullet, but that comes with incredible challenges in terms of its energy intensity and its environmental impacts. So we're really looking at how suites of non-traditional resources might actually reduce the energy intensity of the water sector rather than increase it. The other thing that we're working on that I'm pretty excited about is looking at the opportunity for demand response response services in the water sector. So as we move to more intermittent resources, you have less control over the energy system, which I alluded to before and was kind of alluded to this morning. So the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. So sometimes it would be good to have the capacity to immediately shed load or to add load, depending on the state of the system. Since water services are so energy consumptive, you can start to see opportunities for more flexibility. For years, we've been telling people use electricity in the middle of the night because that's when it's less expensive, and try to conserve during the middle of the day. That model is now flipping on its head. Now we have a ton of solar in the middle of the day, and in some cases we're actually having to curtail those solar resources because there's not enough demand to suck it up. So the water sector could be a huge player in that space. Can you run your pumping systems, for example, to use electricity when the energy is abundant and kind of curtail it when it's not abundant? Can you use flexible water heaters that are adding energy services to that grid? The other thing that we're looking at is how do we utilize these non-traditional water sources? So we've all grown up on a system where we use water once, and in our case, we're importing it hundreds of miles, we're using it once, we're cleaning it up, and we're discharging it to the ocean. So we're really looking at how can you optimize the water that's available to reuse, and what is the highest priority for those uses. Obviously in California, we're not to the point where we're looking at direct potable we're looking at it, but we're not doing direct potable reuse. But as we go forward, that's probably gonna be an option on the table. I don't think we should be moving towards desalination until we absolutely need it, but once we get there, there's really opportunities to couple energy and water infrastructure to leverage efficiencies. So siting a power plant next to a reverse osmosis treatment system, for example, can offer some big coupling efficiencies. Putting a wastewater treatment facility next to a desalination facility also offers some huge opportunities in terms of reducing the energy impacts and the environmental impacts of those systems. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the themes that are going on in my research to date. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Well, let's pick up on your resource and your ideas around demand response, co-location, and the energy costs of water. And Adam, why don't I turn it to you and ask, are you seeing innovations around the country, or is LA and California ground zero for that kind of innovation?
So I think, to Kelly's point in terms of laying out the sort of energy-water nexus discussion and the benefits that can be had both from the water side of the equation and the energy side of the equation, we're actually seeing this across the country. It's not a California-centric issue. I think some of the areas where you see drought playing into that may be a little bit more, clear. But what we are finding is that investments are being made across coasts, East Coast, Midwest, and out to the West. Some actually mid-sized utilities and large utilities, not so much in the small utility sector, for purposes of scale, of trying to capture biogas, et cetera, and use it for running one's plant. We see a huge facility. George Hawkins, who ran DC Water, just retired recently from DC Water, put the Canby system in. He went out and saw a European system that could work very well in terms of being able to both run his energy system much more efficiently and also create a higher quality biosolid product at the end of the process. So he put in this Canby system, an example of innovation taking place, and a lot of that is just the scale of the plant, right? But we're seeing in mid-sized utilities out in Oregon, I think Gresham is the name of the city, fully functioning 100% net zero energy use outside of the plant. They are able to do everything by recovering their own energy locally through the plant's functions. We're also seeing people in terms of utilities, in terms of their fleets, being able to run their fleets on biodiesel, happening in Wisconsin. So this is not something that is exclusive to California in terms of innovation. It is something we are seeing nationally, and one of the things we are trying to do, and there was some discussion in the last panel about, tax-exempt bond usage, et cetera, but it would be nice to continue to see the federal government coming forward and incentivizing, doing two things, incentivizing the right behavior in terms of utility innovation, both in terms of the energy sector and the water sector, but also being able to allow some level of regulatory relaxation, if you will. And that's not the right terminology. I see Felicia, blinking at me over there. But the idea, but the idea is let folks bear a little bit more risk in terms of some of these technologies at the utility, because there are great benefits that can be derived, right? So somehow we have to figure out a way to allow the utility, whether it's in the reuse sphere or the energy production sphere, to take a little bit more risk on.
Let me ask our utility executives here. Elsewhere in the world, is there the same standard for water, kind of going to this question of we spend all this money to clean the water and then we end up sending it out to the ocean? It's my understanding that other countries in the world don't have the same standard and are more focused on water use to the water treatment to the appropriate use. Adele?
I think we have learned a lot from other utilities across the world, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Australia, Israel, and others. In LA here, I think there is a renewed appreciation, especially with the recent drought, of the value of water. If you look at our stormwater permit and the regulations we have, the new stormwater permit that just expired, that was in 2012, it was based on a shift in water quality compliance to say what we want to develop enhanced watershed management plans based on watersheds. And its focus is to capture the majority of the rain and demonstrate you're capturing for reuse or infiltration. That's a huge shift. That's when regulations meets with the needs of the communities and develop something that can allow for that to happen. And that's happening here. There's more needs to be done. To me, it's just the continuing effort and focus. We have to deal with the yuck factor too. We need to change the whole understanding that every drop of water is recycled. There is no new water. Everything that we're seeing comes from somewhere else. And before we do desal, we have so much stormwater, so much wastewater to recycle that we should just do that. And I agree that we should allow for that potential opportunity in the future. So I think we're seeing where regulations are being transformed into more to allow for us to continue improving water quality and doing the job we need to do to protect the environment and the community while providing the flexibility to maximize the resources. So that's happening, and I think we've learned a lot from others.
Harlan, switching the focus a bit, when I think about the energy sector, I see demand response, we're way ahead in that. When I think about efficiencies and innovation and private equity money that's gone into technology in the power sector, it's an enormous part of the private equity pie. Water has not had that focus. And this is a panel about innovation. What do you think it's going to take to get that kind of focus? And if you look at the stats that were that Adam shared with us, 85–90% of water agencies are municipally owned. Privately is a fraction of that. If you look at the power side, it's the reverse. So is there something in that organizational structure that has driven innovation? And with the municipal utilities, will we be able to drive the necessary innovation?
What a question. It's interesting. I would say about 15 years ago, before I was general manager, it was really a concept of producing power. This is when, power cost was high. Our system is a system that, is hydro. So we would just dump water to generate power. And in fact, we're losing about $20 million a year because we operate our system differently. We're
20 billion?
20 million.
20 million.
20
Still,
million,
that's a
sorry.
lot.
20 million a year, and that's just because we became water first. We recognize the value of water, and so it has actually, it's put a strain on our power side because we just don't operate. We built our facilities to maximize water production. We put the penstocks and sized them, the tunnels. We made them a lot larger, and therefore the percentage of the cost to rehabilitate those way on the power side, and we're just not producing enough. And so we recognize that water is something that is precious, and we need to really focus on it. And some of the innovations that we're doing is that we're trying to look at the best source for the best use, but also we're looking at leakages. I mean, it is crazy that, how much water we lose. And so one of the things that we've been doing is trying to automate and put smart meters in. And one of the things that we thought when we start putting this technology in, we have a lot of meter readers, and so since it's automated, we may, have to retrain them for different jobs. And once we put those meters in place, we just realized, holy smoly, we got a lot of leaks in our system. We need to hire people to manage this big data. We need folks to call people and say, you got a leak. And so now we're more proactive because we know that we can actually save water. And so that's what really been driving us in that way. But I would say that in the water industry, it's definitely something that's precious, something that, as Adele said, is just one source of water. And, our system is a little unique on our water side. For Hetch Hetchy, we actually produce more power than we use. And so on the wastewater side, that's where we get in the Candy system, where we're looking at ways to recycle a lot of the energy that by treating, we gain energy that helps hopefully make the plant net zero. And so we're looking at ways to be really smart about it. But, I think in the power side, we have competition. We have Pacific Gas and Electric that we have a relationship. And so, we have customers, they have customers. So it's really interesting to be in a situation where you're trying to have a competitor. But I would say that it's just a really interesting relationship water and power industry have.
Well, there's different like scarcity and pricing to focus one's attention. So we have scarcity and pricing's coming along. I want to make sure we get a question from the audience. I have lots more questions, but is there a question from anyone here? You want to wait till the financing one? Good. No? Okay, let me ask another question just to kind of wrap it up, since we're going to segue into the financing panel. Again, this analogy between what's happened in the power sector and the water sector is interesting as it relates to utility scale solutions and distributed local solutions. And I heard threaded through a number of the presentations how you're looking at local, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, maybe Adam from the national perspective. Where are we going, or what's the balance between distributed water, a la Australia, where rain roofs and catchments, versus utility? How are we going to strike that balance? Okay.
The things that are going on in this world now are very interesting. Part of the issue rests, I think, in a big discussion NACWA members are having in consolidation. frankly.
Consolidation.
And the appropriate role of the private sector, the appropriate role of the public sector. There are even, I have, members of mine who are on the phone with me asking, are there other members who have successfully brought in 2 or 3 towns into their sort of regional utility? How have they done so politically? What's the best way to do this? So it's happening in terms of public to public
P2P.
consolidation. So we always talk about, public-private partnerships. There are also these things called public-public partnerships. We're also seeing an enormous amount of growth. We just had 3 or 4 new members join NACWA who are not-for-profit co-ops who are engaged in the consolidation movement, usually in smaller, sort of the smaller utility segment. So what we're seeing too is a not-for-profit model.
Indianapolis is a great
there's-
example of that.
Correct, and there's a lot of it in Illinois, a lot of it in Iowa, where the co-ops provide services to struggling small utilities who can't fix a water main at the appropriate time on, let's say, Christmas Eve, right? They're offering billing services so that the small utilities can actually get the rates in that they need, right? So we're seeing a consolidation in this not-for-profit model, and the not-for-profit model is interesting because it can keep, to some degree, some of the pricing a little bit lower than some of the privatization models that aren't necessarily attractive to the small. So we're seeing a lot of different things.
I think that is a great sort of segue that we'll move into the next panel, but I see Felicia here, and I'd love to have this governance conversation about, regionalization. What are the incentives? What are the carrots? What are the sticks? P2P, regional, nonprofit, mutual cooperative ventures, because we're going to have to innovate if we want to survive. Thank you. I'm going to ask this panel to segue off, and my next panel come in, and everyone else take a stand-up stretch. Dan Feidelberg, he is a principal with KPMG, but spent many years, several years, as vice chancellor at the University of California in charge of planning and budget at the Merced campus, one of the great new institutions of higher education. And Dan was on the firing line and the front end of bringing alternative delivery from a financing perspective and overall perspective to that Merced campus. Prior to that, he was in the financial services industry at JP Morgan for 10 years. So I tried to hire a great guy, a good financing mind. Next is Jerry Merrill. Jerry is the former Deputy Secretary of the Natural Resources Agency, best known to me for our water bond guru. If you want a water bond passed in California, you have the strategic, brilliant mind of Jerry Merrill at your side, so you can figure out how to get that done. And that is a debt financing vehicle for our water and Delta infrastructure. Next, we're going to hear from Wendell McCain. Wendell brings a private sector perspective also, and his background is in private equity and asset management. He is a managing director and capital partner of Onset Capital Partners and has some focus also in the energy space with a floating solar solutions project. But we're going to focus on innovative financing today. Is that all right, Wendell? And then finally, to wrap up, will be Mr. Nakazono, who is Deputy Manager, Pipeline Division with JFE Engineering from Japan. And I think we can learn so much from Mr. Nakazono from the earthquake resiliency that his company has been very innovative and on the leading edge for pipes and other infrastructure. And California, as an earthquake-rich state, can learn a lot from his experiences. So to give us an overall kind of setup for the panel and big picture of how we should be thinking about, or how we might be thinking about financing in the future of infrastructure and water infrastructure, let's have Dan start.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's a pleasure to be here today. Last year I had the opportunity to present at the VX conference as a representative of the public sector. As Kathleen mentioned, I was still at UC Merced at that time, and There we talked about the process that we undertook to further develop the UC Merced campus. And we were thinking about how that experience can help further our thinking about how we manage infrastructure in California more broadly across infrastructure assets. It's also great to be talking about water issues because while I was at UC Merced in 2015, Professors Roger Bales and Josh Veers launched what we call the UC Water Security and Sustainability Research Initiative. And they are leading a multi-campus effort that's headquartered in Merced, focused on strategic research for better resources management. So I'm thrilled to be here today, again at VX, now in my new role at KPMG as part of this conversation. But in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley today, there's an ambitious expansion of the UC Merced campus under construction. It's a new type of contract with the private sector. It's a $1.3 billion building project, a major investment by the UC Board of Regents, to which they contributed public tax-exempt bonds, not for 100% of the facilities, but for half of the facilities. And this investment will expand access to public higher education and maintain those buildings for generations to come. The project's being delivered through a long-term performance-based availability payment contract. And I'm here because I think the lessons that we learned about why this contracting strategy made sense for the university can also be applied across different types of infrastructure assets, including water. And the bottom line was we undertook this strategy so that we would build what we could afford to maintain. So what does that mean? It means that the facilities we build are designed with a preventative capital maintenance program that is built into the contract through performance standards. And because the facilities will operate to a minimum level based on those performance standards over the life cycle of the buildings, we have confidence that the newest technologies would ultimately be deployed to ensure that those standards are met over the entirety of the asset's life cycle. And so we knew that our underlying civil infrastructure, as well as the social infrastructure, the physical buildings, would be sustainable. We knew that the institution, having shed some of the risk of capital maintenance on our facilities, could turn back to its core mission of teaching, research, and public service. And these concepts are important because the life cycle of our facilities is actually relatively short. Water agencies must ensure that our system can deliver clean, reliable water sources for decades or even centuries. And likewise, universities and colleges are amongst the world's most durable institutions. The oldest in the world being 1,000 years old, and Harvard University being 380. But we're all facing issues about how to adapt to the forces of change and technological change that are outside of our control. And so in its initial phase, the state of California brought traditional finance to building UC Merced through bond financing. And by 2012, as we were emerging from the financial crisis, we realized that the capacity to finance infrastructure in the same way, the capacity for issuing new debt, had become constrained. And so as a result, we needed to look at different solutions. But we faced time pressure because we needed those facilities as soon as possible. We faced questions about financing because we didn't have the financial capacity to bond finance for all of the facilities that would be necessary at that time. And we faced questions about durability and sustainability, about both how we can move away from year-by-year annualized budget processes, but also to ensure that the facilities would be maintained and perform over time. So as we started out, we knew that over the past several decades, public sector agencies have largely focused on the initial infrastructure development and financing. And today, as we look around our markets, we have the world's most robust design, construction, engineering markets. We have the world's most efficient financing markets. But as a society, we haven't conducted preventative capital maintenance for our infrastructure. And so deferred maintenance has become a major issue at all levels of government across all types of infrastructure assets. And since our institutions must stand the test of time and well beyond the useful life of our buildings, capital renewal is really as significant an unfunded liability as pension obligations and retiree health care in our budgets. So to remain durable, Governments can no longer build what we can't afford to maintain, and we have to make decisions based on total life cycle cost and take an outcomes-based approach to make smart investments and ensure a return on that investment. And that's where the consideration of a new delivery model came in for the university. We had set out to identify a structure that would enable us to rapidly build a campus, maintain it over time. And so the availability payment concession model, which we can get into the details of later, enabled an interdisciplinary approach to those issues of design, construction, financing, maintenance, and operations. It enabled the university to share performance and financial risk with the developer because the public agency doesn't pay in full for the facilities at the time they're developed. But in doing so, there's no transfer of property rights to the private developer. It doesn't shift revenue. It does not shift responsibility for providing the public services. It's on balance sheet to the university, and it's really a design build plus model. So the concession model we used is a contract that changes the warranty structure, and it holds the developer accountable. It requires infrastructure to adhere to performance standards, and if those performance standards are not met, payment is withheld. And when performance standards are ultimately bundled with the original capital investment and bundled into a competitive procurement process managed by the public agency, then the public agency can achieve a competition across total life cycle costs. So it's a process that fosters a performance-based approach to life cycle infrastructure management. So this is just one example in a California-based example of performance-based infrastructure, which can potentially apply to other projects. So I look forward to getting into a dialogue here about the details and how that ultimately and potentially applies into the water industry.
Great, so back to the future. Let's go to Jerry and talk about funding through bonds.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm sure many of you here remember 4 years ago almost now that we had Proposition 1 on the ballot. It was a large water bond, and that was following in the tradition of a lot of other water bonds. California has had over 20 water bonds over about 45 years, and Proposition 1 was just another one. It passed and is being implemented, and relatively soon, I understand from Felicia and others, that we'll be exhausting those funds, and it's frankly time for another water bond. Now, the voters in California have been very generous when it comes to water bonds. We've had 21 water bonds on the ballot since 1972. 20 have passed. It's been almost 30 years since the only one that failed a long time ago. And why is that? Everybody in California who lives here for any length of time realizes we have droughts, we have floods, we have an unreliable water supply, we have to move it from north to south, store it. People kind of get that. Granted, they don't quite know where their own water comes from, but in the big picture, they get that their water supply will be impacted if we don't continue to invest. And we have to rely on their generosity when it comes to the state of California, because unlike local agencies who to some extent can raise rates as they need to do so, the state can only provide funding for water infrastructure outside of the State Water Project when the voters approve bonds, and so they've done so many times. And if you look at the need for state water investment, it's not only staggering, it's a little bit scary. We probably have a backlog of $50 to $70 billion in the flood control area alone. And when you look at safe drinking water, wastewater treatment, stormwater, which we've been talking about in the panel earlier, the projected costs are gigantic. The only way to pay for those will be a combination of state and local money. Federal money, what is federal money? We used to have that, but it's been a while. Now, we've been crafting, our organization, our conservation group, has been crafting a water bond for the last 2 or 3 years, trying to figure out what the water needs are, how large it could be, and working with water agencies and conservation groups and others to come up with a water bond. During that time, the legislature also passed a bond, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's by the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Kevin De Leon. He has Senate Bill 5. That will be on the ballot this June. It's primarily a parks measure, but it does have some water elements, especially flood control, some wastewater recycling in the Salton Sea, and a few others. But it's primarily a park measure and doesn't really fill the need that we know we have in the water area. The measure that we're promoting is perfectly compatible with Senate Bill 5. Some people have asked if there's any conflict between those. There is not. There's a little bit of overlap, but that overlap works in a good way, for example, at the Salton Sea. So we do have a bond on in June. This measure that I want to describe to you will be on this November. And it's a fairly large bond, less than $9 billion, so less than high-speed rail or schools or some other bonds that we've had, but still maybe appropriate to the need, which we have a gigantic need in California. Here are some of the main categories. There are a lot of categories, and I can't describe them all, but stormwater, which has been discussed today, over $500 million investment in stormwater. Safe drinking water. Safe drinking water is frankly an embarrassment for a state like this, where we have upwards of 1 million people who don't really have safe and reliable drinking water supplies. This is outrageous, frankly, and the state needs to step in and do what we can to get these poor communities scattered throughout mostly the rural areas of the state, safe drinking water and safe wastewater disposal systems. So that's a very well-funded category, $750 million. Another area that we've been talking about a lot today, wastewater recycling. We do fund that, $400 million of competitive funds at the State Water Board. Water conservation, that's something that also has been discussed today. That's going to be a match with the local agencies, and we know there's a lot more that could be done there. Desalting of inland groundwater supplies, especially. That's very popular in Southern California and increasingly in Northern California, something else we need to do. Many people here today may know about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that was passed by the legislature a few years ago and not very well funded in terms of its implementation. There's a lot that can be done there in terms of recharge, in terms of winter spreading of water across the fields in the Central Valley, and frankly, to some extent, in terms of retirement of land where there's simply never going to be enough water to balance the groundwater budget. That's a $675 million program. Something that we've looked at pretty closely, and the Association of California Water Agencies has emphasized very strongly, is better management of our watersheds. If you tour the Sierra, if you went up there many years ago and admired the ancient forests and so on, and there are places where you would be shocked to see what's happened. We've either had devastating sort of ecotype change, where we've gone from forest to brushlands in some places, or other places where fire recovery has resulted in enormous thick stands of young trees that can't really all survive and that are using up way too much water. Dr. Bales, who was just mentioned, is an expert in that area. We have a very large investment in helping to restore our watersheds. The Fryan-Kern Canal, some of you know about that, I'm sure, a canal that runs from Bakersfield to Fresno, sank during the drought due to groundwater overdraft. It can't deliver the water it needs to, and so it's going to lead to more groundwater overdraft if that's not fixed. So that's another large allocation. Flood control in a wide variety of areas is addressed. And to bring it down a little bit locally, the Los Angeles River, something that people admire and want to restore here, is well funded as well. And the conservancies that serve this area, Santa Monica, Rivers and Mountains, and so on. The Salton Sea is something not a lot of people know about, but if we don't do something, we're going to have one of the worst air quality disasters ever seen in the continental United States. It's got to be fixed. We cannot have the Salton Sea turn into a dust bowl of blowing dust or bad odors that people in Ventura have occasionally noticed. So we've got to address that, and we do in a substantial way. I can't describe all the programs, but there are a lot of them, and I'm going to give you at the end a website where you can go to find all of them. What we like about this measure is that it's a good coalition. We have the water agencies, Association of California Water Agencies, the other NACWA, that's the Northern California Water Agency, Southern California Water Committee endorsed last week, many others. We do have conservation groups supporting this. Ducks Unlimited, Save the Bay, California Waterfowl, a lot of conservation groups get the need for watershed restoration, so we're very proud of that. Environmental justice groups like the Community Water Center have endorsed because safe drinking water is such a huge priority. And we do a lot to benefit disadvantaged communities in the individual programs. Finally, what's really been interesting is the involvement of commodity agriculture, the rice industry, dairy, pistachios, citrus, many others have been very involved in helping to get this measure to the ballot. And in fact, our funding comes 1/3 from the water groups, 1/3 from agriculture, 1/3 from conservation groups. So we like to think of that as a good balance. What I'd like to ask today is, if you're from the public sector, please endorse this measure. Nothing is more credible to the voter than to hear their local water agency actually think this is a good idea. And so we're working very hard to get public sector water supply endorsements. If you're from the private sector, well, there are ways you can help us there too. And they mostly revolve around helping to communicate with the voters, which is very expensive these days. And all of our donations, of course, come from the private sector. We can't have any public money in this. So, to summarize, here's the website, waterbond.org. Can you believe that was available? Waterbond.org has all the information and a way to communicate with us if you'd like to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Wendell?
Well, I tell you, after hearing you speak, I think that I have a bright future in the solutions business around water from the private sector perspective. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here. I think at onset, what we sort of recognized early is that when you think about all of the natural resources, that almost every resource, there's almost a substitute. And water is really, there is no substitute for water. It's the only resource that I can think of. You can think about, petrol resources, you can think about alternative energy, but at the end of the day, water is the basis of human life, and there is nothing that we can use in its place. And so it's incredibly critical to all of our livelihoods, and it's the basis of life. So we have spent a lot of time focusing on solutions to existing water problems and trying to come up with private sector solutions for that. And to that end, I'll take just a hot second, and I think all of you have had one of these in your chair. And so in short, I'll tell you why we thought it was an interesting private sector solution, because it was a confluence of sort of two things, which is renewable energy and the conservation or decreasing the evaporation of water. So by putting floating solar on non-recreational reservoirs, just if you turn to the back of the page, it really demonstrates the power of the ability to conserve water. On 12.5 acres, just taking a 5 megawatt system, if you look at the evaporation savings, it's about 50 acre feet of water. And that translates to over 16 million gallons of water just with a 5 megawatt system. And so you can see the impact is fairly significant. Not to mention, when we've looked at alternative sources of financing some of these projects, what we've been able to find is for public institutions, an organization that's willing to finance 100% of the cost with a 25 to 30 year amortization at a 3.3% interest rate, which we think is incredibly attractive financing. Well, what's the benefit of the ownership for that municipality or that municipal or state municipal water agency organization is that the levelized cost of energy gets below 7 cents, and they own the system, and the water savings are calculated in that. So we thought that's an interesting way to kind of get a double benefit from two resources, particularly in the state of California where water, as we know, is a big issue, and there is a quest to continue to evolve and proliferate with renewable energy to go to a 100% renewable energy standard. So those are the kind of things that we look for in financing projects. What I would also say is that we think there's a tremendous opportunity to partner with the private sector because of the unprecedented amount of dollars that have been raised in private credit funds as well as infrastructure funds. And because of that onslaught of capital, what we're seeing is for projects that are operational, that the yields or the expected returns have been driven down from the historical mid-teens levels down to 7, 6, 5%, implicit cost of capital. And so when you think about financing, I'm all for and a big advocate of the role of government in financing, water infrastructure. But I think everyone in this room could probably agree that there is a tremendous demand and there's a finite amount of capital, even from the public sector, to address all of those issues. So I think we have to think outside of the box, think about ways to partner with the private sector, do some of the risk shifting from the public sector to the private sector. And also, I think it's a unique time because the cost of capital is so low. So one of the things that we think that's incredibly important to be able to make that happen is, quite frankly, that it has to be packaged in a fashion that folks from the private alternatives world are sort of accustomed to. And what does that mean? I'll give you the classic example. In the real estate world, there's something that's been called credit tenant lease financing that's been around forever and a day. And we're now starting to have very interesting discussions with folks who understand that there's a series of cash flow payments that are contractual over some long period of time. And unlike real estate, and most of the things that you think about around water infrastructure tend to have more operational pieces to them. So in order to get folks to feel secure to invest in these assets, we have to get a level of comfort around performance, as you alluded to earlier, and making sure that from an operational and maintenance standpoint, that seems like it's not only is it functional, but there's a way to audit it, and there's a way to make sure that there's consistent maintenance so you don't have deferred maintenance issues, right? And so we've seen what happens with deferred maintenance issues in a lot of public infrastructure today, and we're trying to take a page out of that book to not repeat, unfortunately, a bad lesson learned. So maintenance, operational maintenance, the ability to give folks a lot of confidence around the functioning long-term of these assets with the proper warranties, proper performance guarantees, we think presents a tremendous opportunity. And because there's so much credit available in the marketplace today, private credit players who would have never looked at infrastructure in general are now starting to deploy capital, which we think is, a great way to kind of bridge that gap or that gorge between, what needs to be funded and the capital that's available. So that's sort of my opening comments.
Great, thank you very much, Wendell. Mr. Nakazono.
Okay, so actually I'm pipe engineer, but I know, sir, I would like to talk about Japanese experiences. Actually, so in Japanese case, also the Japanese water works facing financial crisis because of the decrease in population. And at present, the Japanese government, Ministry of Health and Labor and Welfare suggests to collaborate with each water utility to expand workforce and centralize the water treatment plant. But if the earthquake occurs, the water is not there in the local because of the centralized. At that time, the seismic pipe is necessary. Can I talk to our pipe? And actually, okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Hayato Nakazono from JFE Engineering Corporation. First of all, I would like to express our appreciation to Consulate General of Japan, JETRO LA, and the event organizer for providing us this opportunity, for giving us such a pretty venue. Yeah, and actually, so we are the steel manufacturing company. Our brother company is Jeffrey Steel Corporation, which is the 9th biggest steel manufacturing company in the world. That's why we know how to deform the steel. We know very well about the characteristic SPF. And this is picture. So this case in the Taiwan, but Japan and Taiwan and here, so there are a lot of earthquake. And if the earthquake occurs and fault plane appeared on the surface, the pipeline can be damaged, just like this situation. And you see the pipeline was deformed as Z-shape, and finally it was broken away. And so we have developed the steel manufacturing, steel pipe, special steel pipe, so-called SPF, in 2012. As a steel manufacturing company, so we have dealt with the steel for over 100 years. Based on that experiences, yeah, we know the characteristic of the steel. And as you can see, the pipe with web feature was a very simple structure, but it well-engineered product. So the shape of web feature and how to set up the web feature, it is so our secret. But yeah, so yes, exactly. This is secret.
Engineers
product.
bring
Yes.
the pipe, there you go.
And yeah, that's why, so yeah, thanks to that, the great impact of the earthquake can be observed without leakage. And so this is set up the web feature. So thanks to that, so we can continuously supply the water even after the big earthquake, ground deformation. And yeah, and since it's innovation, so we have several installations in Japan, such as the 96-inch diameter steel pipe for Kobe City Water Works Bureau. And in US, since 2016, so we have carried out the performance test, collaborate with the Cornell University about the compression, tension, bending, cyclic, and spirit basin test. All the test was carried out. And it was great success. So the test result exceeded everyone's expectation, including me, honestly. And yeah, so we strongly feel that so we can contribute our engineering service and product to the West Coast community of the US for water resiliency. So actually, so now we are in discussion with some authority in US. And if you have time, so please visit our booth. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, resiliency rules here. So I like the innovation that you bring to us, and we certainly have earthquakes as a threat. Let me ask a question about governance, because we talked about that in the last panel. And listening to you, Jerry, on the bond program, is there any way to create a carrot or stick for the allocation of bond funds, assuming your bond measure passes, that would incentivize agencies to be more efficient and consolidate where appropriate, given the proliferation of water agencies in the state? Has that ever been contemplated in
Yes. There's a number of things you can do. One is, in most state grant programs, there's a requirement or at least a suggestion they should have matching funds. Often that means that agencies will work together to provide the matching funds so that they can successfully apply for the grant. However, to look at the other side of that, it's important for disadvantaged communities to be able to access these funds. Often that means they need to consolidate with a larger agency so they can efficiently apply. And so we encourage that as well by giving sort of breaks to disadvantaged communities. The other thing we did in this bond is allow for, in most projects, part of the bond money to be set aside as a reserve and to generate interest that can be used to maintain the project. We've heard a lot about maintenance. This is the first bond that extensively is putting out money to allow the projects to be maintained. And for every agency, that's always the top priority.
Yeah, another question I had listening to the presentations, there are funding mechanisms or financing mechanisms, and then there's funding. They're different things. What the bond measure that you're talking about and the bonds that we've had are general obligation bonds. They have no funding other than the state general fund. Doesn't have a revenue stream associated with it. So when people are voting for it, they're voting for the authority to borrow money. do you see, limitations on the state's capacity to borrow, given the backlog of infrastructure needs? And how does this bond measure fit into that?
This sounds like the former treasurer speaking here. actually. And as of course you know, it's imprudent for the state to borrow too much, because then you end up spending too much of your general fund on bond service. And generally speaking, the state of California has come close to what's considered sometimes the prudent limit of 6% or so of the general fund. But I want to say that your brother has been extraordinary in keeping bond expenditures down.
He hates bonds. He hates borrowing.
And so,
there's lots of
really,
capacity.
what we've seen in the last election, when the Secretary of State put their handbook out, was our expenditures of the general fund for bond service are now less than 5%, and therefore our bond rating is now at extraordinarily high, equivalent to AAA rating. And I think that we do need to continue these bond expenditures, because the general fund doesn't spend any other money on infrastructure. It's spent on day-to-day operations of state government and local government, and only a couple of percent at most is spent on infrastructure. So bonds, schools, water, parks go into capital outlay, go into infrastructure, and as long as we stay within the prudent limit, I think it's a good investment.
Dan, let me ask you, before you went to UC, you were on the private sector and worked in both tax exempt and taxable financings and some public-private partnerships. What is it that you see private capital looking for? And Wendell touched on it, but if you're looking for private capital to augment your capital stack, your development, what is the private sector going to look for?
The private sector is going to look for an investment that the public agency is committed to and has an extremely high creditworthiness to it. Similar to tax-exempt general obligation bonds clearly have the backing of the state general fund. Any project-based investment is going to need a security of return, either based upon on the revenue stream that is pledged to its repayment. And we have traditionally, when we think about public-private partnerships, really had a conversation about privatization and revenue transfer, taking revenue risk, which gets quickly into issues about the control of the underlying investment. As markets have evolved, there are options to look at revenue-based approaches as well as fixed payment-based approaches, and both of those are available, and that begins to change the question of control. It also begins to enable public agencies to leverage state investments in water. So the question becomes, how do we take a $9 billion investment by the state of California in a new water bond and ultimately incent $27 billion of investment with a new investment by the private sector in public-private partnerships?
Wendell, do you have other thoughts about private capital and private equity funds investing in infrastructure and water or technologies that we were hearing about in the other panel to make delivery of water more efficient and cost of development more efficient?
Right. I mean, and I think we focus a lot on technologies. Those are the things that I think inherently that folks from the private equity world and the venture world are very comfortable with. But as we talk about sort of more stabilized assets, I think it really goes back to the point of you've got to have a credit-worthy off-taker or counterparty. We're really agnostic about really privatizing assets. I mean, our view is we're a partner of the public sector, so we're sensitive to the issues around governance. Water is a highly sensitive asset, and if you look historically, when you think about all the instances where water has tried to be privatized in this country, it's been an abominable disaster, so we kind of stay away from that. But what we're trying to do is figure out how we can deliver it more efficiently, how we can reduce the cost. If you think about power, electricity/power, really one of the biggest expenses or the biggest uses of power is actually moving water around. right? So we think about how can we lower the cost of delivery for electricity that has an impact on how efficiently water can be moved throughout the system. So technology is obviously a huge component of that. And in that, we're trying to reduce operating costs, make it more efficient, and effectively make that public dollar that's being raised either through bond financing or other sources of public finance. How do we help our public sector partner stretch the dollars they have allocated to them to be able to allocate across more of their needs? And so that's kind of where we focus, and that's the business case that we always try to put forward first.
And Mr. Nakasono, do you have any comments on Japan's approach in the innovation space? Any comments that you'd like to make?
Yes. So actually, we carried out the corner test by own company's money, so not funding. That's why. So previously, Mr. Adel said there. So it is good keyword is limited to budget. That's why there more than one benefit we should get. That's why through the Cornell University, we understand the applicability of this web feature, not only the forward crossing, but also the landsliding and the ground subsidence, and these many kinds of the ground deformation can be observed. Yes, through our
Good.
innovation. Yeah.
Let me invite the audience to have some questions. I think, Mike George, you had one a few panels ago that related to finance, but you've got some good talent here to ask away.
Well, and there's been some good discussion here, but I think, Jerry, you said there used to be federal money. That federal money came with a lot of strings attached to it. The money went away, the strings stayed in place. How do we educate the federal government that they can't maintain the strings that are now strangling local, private, and public investment?
Well, I think the way to communicate with the federal government is through the vote of the people, in a sense. If the voters in California approve this bond or previous bonds, and those bonds have explicit, instructions to the state agencies, I think that's a message to carry back to the federal government saying, don't interfere with what the voters just approved. In the democracy we live in, a public vote is kind of the ultimate way you can get approval by the body politic. And so I'm hoping that if this bond is approved, and it does implement a lot of projects, like the Salton Sea project, for example, where there's a lot of potential federal involvement, that the federal government will pay attention to what the voters want and try to comply with it and release or at least reduce those constraints that might prevent some of these funds from being expended. It's really the best way we had to communicate is the public actually voting, I think.
Well, I like that's a hopeful thing, but I think of the voters in California having approved, for instance, cannabis, and I don't see the federal government falling in line with the votes of the people.
You probably touched on an area where they're a little more sensitive than they are to infrastructure. I guess. I'm hoping with the new federal emphasis on infrastructure that this will be a sign that
they're
at least,
for infrastructure. They're against cannabis.
Yeah, right. Apparently. Well, we think they're for infrastructure. So all we can hope is that this will incentivize Congress and the administration to come up with some matching funds to match our infrastructure. I think that's the best message we could send them.
I saw another question over here. Yes. Yes.
I have a question for Dan. So the UC Merced project, it kind of seems like a hybrid between a P3 and a design build. Could you explain a little?
The question was, the UC project UC Merced sounded like a hybrid between a P3 and a design build.
Well, if you define P3 as a contract that is different from what governments have used in the past to build infrastructure, it's a P3. There were hybrid mechanisms brought to bear. It was a $1.3 billion project. The UC Board of Regents chose to invest $600 million of its own money, which was financed and will be financed with tax-exempt, low-cost bonds. And the purpose of that is to manage down the weighted cost of capital. But it was a performance-based public-private partnership where the balance of that investment is made by the private sector, and subject to the functionality and the performance of the buildings that are currently being built, UC will have the obligation to make fixed payments to the developer over time, and the developer would then use those dollars to repay the financing it has raised in the private markets. So when we get into conversations about control, there's no change of control for any element of student housing, of recreational facilities. There's no revenue being collected by the private party. But the private party is taking on substantial amounts of risk in return for an investment it has made in putting up public buildings that will achieve performance standards. And the reason why I focus so much on performance standards is it goes to the mechanism by which, when you're developing a new capital project, that governments can embed new technologies into their projects without having to take responsibility for affirmatively choosing the technology they might purchase. So if a public agency is interested in installing pipes that bring seismic resiliency, or achieving a major reduction in the amount of water evaporation on a reservoir, they don't have to affirmatively go purchase the product. They will say in their contracting mechanism that I need a much lower evaporative result from my reservoir, and I need X amount of energy. And the private sector will go out and respond to that procurement with solutions. And those solutions are available in the market. So this really becomes about the ability of public agencies to go buy technology, achieve performance in their infrastructure without taking responsibility for the technology risk.
Well, this is a kind of a final question, how to marry the comments you made, Dan and Jerry. The life cycle costs are just not built in to historically, into most public sector infrastructure projects. We're going to vote for a bond for water infrastructure. How do we build in the life cycle consciousness? Because the first thing that gets cut in public agencies, we see it in transportation, we see it in water, we see it at DWP, where the water infrastructure hasn't been kept up. Jerry and Dan, can we marry your two concepts together, or the bond financing and the infrastructure life cycle?
Well, we included, Orrick Harrington, if I can mention another law firm, gave us the green light some years ago to include reserve funds for operation and maintenance for this very reason.
Okay,
You
good.
simply have to maintain these kinds of projects. And it's not just the infrastructure, it's even landscapes or watersheds where you have to maintain. Look at the Sierra, we haven't maintained it. And so you can't go too far. We don't want to be like New York City,
Right.
have all of our bonds go to O&M. But we do have an allocation in a lot of areas just because of that reason. We have to
Great.
have that.
Good. Wendell, one last comment,
I'll say
and
one
we're
quick
going to lose
thing,
it
and
to
I
lunch.
think, I take maybe I would characterize it the same way but slightly different, which is, I think Dan's point is a very good point, because what it does is, particularly in the public-private partnership model, the evolution is that there has to be an alignment of interest. And I think the second component is, effectively, it's a risk transfer. So today, the public sector isn't making a bet on the technology, but they're transferring that risk to the private sector partner to say, here's what our performance and expectations are over the life of this concession or over the life of this asset. And so here's what you're responsible for. How you accomplish that mission is your decision, but we have a baseline of performance that's expected, and any cost variances, you bear the risk. And that takes the risk out of the public sector's hands. And what it does is it really caps the downside risk of being responsible for that asset or miscalculating reserves, for example, right? So I think that's a really
Great.
important point as we think about allocation of capital going forward.
Well, we've heard a lot about water resiliency, financing, infrastructure, and there's more to do and more to come. So let's give a big thanks to our panel and head to lunch. Thank you.